Higehiro might just be the most interesting anime to have come out in the past couple of years. Just from the first episode alone, the way that it uses a slice of life show in order to tell a story with very real commentary on actual issues in the world is impressive. And it's exactly the kind of thing that I've been waiting for in the slice of life genre. It's a show that transcends the concept of cute girls doing cute things. And while there is an inherent cuteness to the entire thing, it's also surrounded by this constant air of darkness. Not to mention that it's filled with allegories and metaphors that make critical watching rewarding, as you'll always notice a new part about it. On its surface, the show seems like another self-insert wish fulfillment ordeal with a broken main male character who finds a teenage girl who ends up lightening up his life. But as we learn more about this runaway teenage girl, we begin to get a clearer picture that there's far more to her than just being a simple Mary Sue, and she clearly comes from a place of darkness. Now, from just this alone, the story's already pretty good, but it's when you look a little bit deeper and between the lines of what's going on that the real beauty of this show comes out, because Higehiro may just be one of the most poetic and well-written criticisms of the Iraq War that I've seen since Howl's Moving Castle. And it's honestly incredible with how approachable and digestible they made this complex topic into. By turning the mistakes of Bush and Cheney into a deceptively cute and wholesome anime is a perfect way to get the message out to the new generation, who's too young to remember most of this stuff, as well as exploring the long-term effects that this had on the citizens of Iraq. And the way that the show goes about this is through a non-stop onslaught against the US propaganda of the time and the very concept that America should be the center of the world. It's important to remember that Bush portrayed the war in Iraq as being absolutely necessary for the survival of America, in addition to being ultimately beneficial for the people in Iraq as well. The way it was portrayed was that the USA was a form of savior, with a regime that was planning on destroying the world with weapons of mass destruction. Much like Bush, the main character of Higehiro is an unreliable narrator, and it's important to note that we are seeing the story through his eyes. The beginning of the episode opens up with him quite literally being drunk when he makes the decision to take this girl in. From our perspective, as the MC, he's saving this girl from the cruelties of the world, and of the oppressive household that she came from. However, it's important to note that we only see this scene with the context of Yoshida being drunk when he first meets Sayu, with him barely even remembering the encounter later on. Thus, we're not really getting an accurate representation of Yoshida's relationship with Sayu. Rather, the information that we're seeing here is one based entirely on Yoshida's perception of himself and Sayu. A small but important distinction to make. In case you haven't figured it out already, Yoshida is meant to represent George Bush, or perhaps on a larger scale, America as a whole during this time period, while Sayu is meant to represent specifically the people of Iraq, not Saddam Hussein or the US-backed government put in place afterwards. And through this one simple opening exchange, the anime's already expertly conveyed the attitudes of the American and Iraqi people at the time. It's important to remember that back then, the view of the war was a whole lot different. Tons of people in the United States genuinely believed that the war was in the best interest of both countries, and the people of Iraq were open to any alternative than the brutal dictatorship they'd been living under. Much like how Sayu agrees to go with Yoshida, not necessarily because it's what she wants to do, but instead because it's all she can do. And for as much as Yoshida sees himself as being a savior, and while yes, he is certainly better than all of the people that Sayu has stayed with before, he's far from perfect, and it's doubtful whether he can even be called morally good. The selfless act for Yoshida to do would be to provide Sayu with a place to live, in addition to helping her find a genuine job that could then get her the money to live on her own. While this is partially addressed, instead of having her do all of his chores at home, he could have let her stay there until she had enough money saved up in the bank to then be able to go out on her own. Again, this parallels perfectly with real life. When the USA entered into Iraq, Saddam Hussein was deposed from leadership. However, the new government that was formed was not exactly selfless in how the US went about creating it. Instead, it acted more as a puppet state, allowing the United States to take as much oil as they wanted, while the rest of the country was plummeted into anarchy, as the USA completely failed to help them rebuild and provide the stability that was greatly needed, instead declaring victory when in reality all that had been done was the bare minimum. A constant theme in Higehiro is lust and the idea of selling oneself just to make ends meet. While this might initially come off as being a bit of overbearing fan service and kinda creepy, the reality here is that this is actually a very complex extended metaphor for the role that oil played in the invasion of Iraq. Yoshida makes it no secret that one of the main reasons why he lets her stay over is because of the fact that she's attractive. In other words, he is getting a direct benefit from keeping her at his house, much in the same way that the United States was getting a direct benefit from quote-unquote helping out Iraq through extracting as much oil as they could. It's also important to note that people didn't simply accept the United States invasion of Iraq at the time. There was actually global protests against it, and one of the largest political movements in history, with all of the coalition governments experiencing the worst of it in their own countries. Remember how I said earlier that Americans believed that they were truly the good guys in this situation? Well, this is portrayed in the show as well. When Yoshida goes and tells his coworker what's happened, his coworker is visibly weirded out by the entire ordeal and raises some serious questions as to what Yoshida is thinking. He tells him that the situation's not worth it, that he needs to look at what he's doing from a more realistic perspective, and that frankly he shouldn't be doing it at all. In this instance, his coworker acts as an allegory for the national response to the invasion. Outside of the bubble that was the coalition countries, the rest of the world was horrified and disgusted by the flimsy accusations and pathetic attempt at restructuring that the coalition had engaged in. All it took was the United States making false accusations about weapons of mass destruction to convince the entire country to go to war. His coworker represents the reasonable person who's not caught up in their own ego and instead sees the situation for what it really is. Exploitation for the sole purpose of getting money and having power over others. While in the show, this is portrayed as Yoshida's desire for a companion, as well as his desire for authority over women. But the extended metaphor doesn't end there. At the start of the episode, we see Yoshida getting rejected by a colleague and him being visibly upset over it, with him meeting Sayu shortly afterwards. And it's clear that these past experiences of his and his failure at love has caused him to become desperate, leading him to make the morally questionable choice of bringing her in. This is a perfect parallel to the economic and moral state of the United States during the early 2000s. Having just come off of 9/11, as well as the dot-com bubble burst, by 2003, the United States economy was in ruins, and the government needed to act quickly. In the anime, taking in a homeless teenage girl is the answer. In real life, starting an extremely long war to get oil and ensure that products were being produced for the military-industrial complex was the answer. And to end things off here, by the end of the first episode, Higehiro has completely covered the entire first part of the invasion of Iraq, up to the point where the insurgency then began to start. And we can see this in the show too. The episode ends off on a sort of calm before the storm, a clear nod to how there was a short period of peace in Iraq before the reality of the situation began to set in. So with the episode setting the stage for future conflicts to occur, I've gotta give a massive applause to Higehiro. Few shows go as far as this one did, in its extended metaphor, as well as duping the viewer into watching something that's far deeper than most of them even realized. To put it simply, I believe that Higehiro is an instant classic. A show that's going to be remembered for the ages, both for what it is and for what it represents. And this show may just be the turning point for anime as an art form, where complex topics can be approached with nuance, all the while never sacrificing the cuteness that brings us to watch it in the first place. Go watch Higehiro. You're doing yourself a disservice if you don't.